Sorry, just the technicals at the beginning. We're not in the same room. You're welcome, and thank you for your time this morning. So a little bit about our agenda. I think we would have circulated this on the email. So we're going to talk a little bit about who we are. First of all, talk about the fundamentals, and that's the fundamentals of good governance. Then we're going to talk a little bit about the governance code for sport and the requirements of that. And buried in the requirements, and I suppose the fundamentals of good governance lead into the evaluation of the board performance, and also self-assessment of the individual board members. A little bit about that, and then evidencing good compliance and evidencing good governance, good compliance with the codes, and then obviously Fiona mentioned the question and answer session. For those of you who don't know us, this is who we are, calQrisk. We've been involved in this business for the governance, risk and compliance business for 13 years at this stage. And we supply a software tool to regulated entities generally. The people most interested in what we do are people who are dealing with regulators. So you get an idea of the kind of people we're dealing with on the list there. And one of the reasons we're with, I suppose, this webinar dealing with national governing bodies and LSPs is we formed a partnership with the Federation of Irish Sport, basically in a conversation about good governance, and that's how we came to develop content around governance for the basically for Irish sport based on the Irish Code. So let's start at the very beginning and talk a little bit about governance. Corporate. This is an OECD description, I suppose, or definition of the board of a governing body, and it's kind of self-explanatory, but it gives an idea of the kind of things at the highest level. So, just as background, I've served on boards at the significant corporate level, also on a state body for over 10 years, and on a couple of not-for-profits. So a fair idea. I've got some experience of the kind of things and some idea of the kind of requirements. And that's, I suppose, what gives me special interest in this whole space. But the fundamentals of what a board governing body should be doing is, you can see here, reviewing and guiding the corporate strategy. Strategy is key. The major plans, so turning those into objectives, preventing conflicts of interest, or at least identifying conflicts of interest and ensuring that those conflicts of interest are properly managed, balancing demands of the organization. It's a general oversight role. And I suppose, depending on the size of the organization, I'm conscious today that the audience will be of different sizes. You know, some of the NGBs in Ireland that we're working with are all voluntary. They don't have any executive, and some of them are incredibly large organizations with very complex environments. But at the end of the day, for a board of directors, the mission is more or less the same. Second set of definitions, the code, the governance code for sport, emanated from the conversation that went on around the voluntary codes for charities. Eventually they split away because it became obvious that the two were slightly different. Housing associations in Ireland also split away with a different code because to make them more relevant. And the sport one, the definition here is the Charities Governance Code, and then underneath it is the definition from the good governance. But it's really, at the end of the day, fundamentals of governance about achieving the objectives with integrity, being efficient and effective. It's also about understanding the organization and its internal and external context. We're going to talk a little bit about context shortly. But governance it's a means to an end. It's not the end in itself. I often, in training, align governance requirements. It's something an organization, because the code has been established, something an organization is expected to do. Codifying the governance has caused organizations to have a kind of a roadmap about what they need to do. There's also a very strong statement from the regulator about what the requirements are. But having got that strong statement, you then have to put it into the context of the organization. As I said to you, the NGBs are very complex organizations. The mission and strategy may have to deal with participation at the earliest age and high volume across complex membership structure, perhaps regional structure. Some of it goes all the way to global international elite competition. And some of the NGBs are responsible for dealing with, they're the keeper of the rules of the activity, responsible up to Olympic level. So you have that, and then you have all the other bits and pieces that are the norms, if you like. It's woven into the fabric. The governance piece is woven into the fabric of everything that you do. And the level of responsibility that the NGB takes for club activity, that varies across sports. It's been our experience. And then so that the governance regimes will differ sport to sport, depending on the degree to which the NGB is involved with the clubs. And on top of that, then there are the national initiatives, things like gender balance, things like inclusion and accessibility. Basically, it's a complex mix of stuff is probably the best way to describe it. But if you condense the fundamentals, and that's partly why we came here this morning, I would say a credible strategy is the first thing. And by a credible strategy, the board drives the strategy of the organization and works with the executive where applicable. So if there is an executive, to convert the strategy into a meaningful plan with smart objectives. The strategy has to be credible in that the stakeholders who read it need to feel that the direction is well thought out and it has at the highest level enough ambition to be challenging and enough resource to be realizable in a fair wind. I put in the fair wind there because a lot of the time the strategy is written, it's written using assumptions about the future. And down at the bottom, I've put in here, informed by the current and future context. The context changes. So a fair wind is, it's reasonable at the time the strategy is written to expect these kind of outcomes if nothing goes wrong. And that's how the strategy should be written. It needs to be inclusive enough so every stakeholder can find themselves included in the future vision that the strategy is designed to bring about. So basically the strategy is talking about where we are today, where we want to be in 3 or 5 years' time, and the vision of the future state, or where we are in 5 years' time, needs to be something that the people who are involved in the sport can subscribe and attach themselves to it. Say, yeah, that looks fine to me. Now, it's important to point out that some organizations, when they put a strategy together, if they drive for too much ambition in the strategy, or they put a very high bar into what they're trying to achieve, or what they write down that they're trying to achieve, the organization can become dispirited if it isn't actually achieved. So steady state is okay as a strategy. There's nothing wrong with that. If your organization is functioning well, you don't need, and it's a small organization with growing or retaining its current membership, whatever your position is, that's your starting point. Don't overstate or overreach your future state in the strategy. Because as I say, it can be off-putting for people who feel it's not achievable. When designing and agreeing the strategy, you are managing basically the future of your sport, and the strategy must be designed to protect the long-term value of the organization. The other issue with strategy is should be, certainly in my opinion, reviewed annually. When you have a strategy that looks across 3 or more years, reviewing it annually allows new board members, new stakeholders, new key stakeholders, the opportunity to offer fresh input when you're going through that review process. It's not a full rewrite, but a review. So if you've got some changes, some new people, maybe some new executive, new board members, they get an opportunity to understand where the strategy came from and to get bought into the strategy. The second one is the objectives. Now, the SMART objectives being specific, measurable, achievable, realistic, and time-bound objectives. You've all heard the phrase, you all know what it's about. Strangely enough, that objectives that we come across aren't SMART. They're more vision statements. So when you're sort of dealing with, if you're at board level and you're dealing with the executive, it's the executive will be charged with the responsibility of delivering the objectives. And these are the operational objectives. And the translation of the strategy into a series of operational objectives, it's the interface between the longer term ambition of the organization and the short to medium term operational plan. The operational objectives deal with managing the present of the sport. So it's the current working plan of the organization. Now, what do the objectives look like? In some cases, you're looking at, say, for example, societal compliance requirements. They're mandated. So those objectives turn up. Sometimes they're not even written down, but they happen to be there. So there's an objective, I would say, most organizations mightn't have it written down, but they will have an objective to be compliant with all legal and regulatory requirements. And that's the HR stuff. It's the revenue commissioner stuff. It's being VAT compliant. It's being PAYE compliant. It's about your company registration stuff if you're a limited company, the health and safety stuff, the basically hard, known musts of being in business, offering a sport, in this case, you're covering things like safeguarding, you're covering things like vetting, all of that, they're the hard musts. And then add the Sports Governance Code, and that is added relevant to the organizational size. So fortunately, when they wrote the code, it's written in with 3 types. So it's written recognizing the size of organizations. So the A, B, and C type is written down. But so one of the objectives will be to comply with the relevant type of code. And another objective would be now around those national ambitions, if you like, about inclusion, about gender balance, about diversity, etc. But make them SMART. So when you make them SMART, what you're looking at is the realistic part is important, time bound. So yeah, by then we will have this. So if you, for example, have a board that's all male, and you make an objective to say we will be 25% female representation on the board by the end of next year, then that's a SMART objective. It's time bound and it's specific. And that's the kind of thing you're talking about to cause those achievements. And again, breaking those down, you'll have operational ones as well. I mean, you'll have your participation ones, you'll have your growth, you'll have your number of clubs, you'll have all of those as well. They should be the same. They should be SMART, make them time bound and specific, particularly. The next one, the effective communication. This is always something, I suppose, when you're dealing with planning. Sometimes the greatest plans are developed and nobody knows about them. So there's not much point in good plans, strategies, strong objectives if all the right people do not know about them, and particularly where they fit into the achievement of them. So right through the organization, people need to be able to see, well, this is the strategy, these are the operational plans, this is what the organization is trying to achieve, and here's my part in that. And sometimes it'll be a very small part in a sport, whether they're volunteering. They don't need to read it in detail, they just need to feel that it's there, and that inclusion in the communication process, the occasional how are we doing, be it delivered by social media, be it delivered by newsletter, however it's delivered, that inclusive part, that communication of the plan, very important. Good, clear communication should be from the board down, and keep the communication channels open. It helps avoid misunderstanding, it helps avoid misinterpretation. One of the things that it also helps avoid is scope creep. So basically, sometimes projects get going and before you know it, they are doing things that were never in the plan. They were doing things that were never in the strategy, and they become little empires of their own. Good communication about what is and isn't in the plan, what is and isn't in the remit of whoever's picking stuff up to do. That's important. The other thing about communication is celebrate successes and share concerns. So if you've got some issues going on, let people know that you're looking at these issues. And when you've got successes, we're generally fairly good at sharing the successes. Sometimes we're not that good at sharing the concerns. The next piece is effective measurement. Again, fundamental. There's no point in having a plan if you don't know how you're doing against it. And basically, you have to measure things to make sure that they're managed. No point in having the objective. You cannot regularly see how you're doing against it. In compliance and risk, this is a monitoring process, generally asking and getting regular affirmation that the controls are working as designed, seeing issues then and having a process to rectify them. And that process should also be measurable. So you see something that's of concern where a control is weakened, or there's something that shouldn't be happening that is happening, or something that isn't happening that should be happening. When you're asking some regular question about how that control is working, you see something going wrong with it, have a corrective and preventive action plan and task management system that allows you to see and make the fix visible, that somebody has assigned the fix, somebody's about doing it, and the thing gets fixed. So measuring is it's an important part of the whole process, and by extension the governance process. You'll always know the key business metrics. You know the income and expenditure stuff. You know the participation. You probably know the membership numbers. You know the attendances if you've got big events. You know what incidents the organisation has within it. You know complaints, etc. Advice in fundamental terms is don't over measure it. And when you do collect data, make sure you use it. There's an awful lot of data collected that isn't used, and then people get frustrated with the fact that they've put in the thing. Well, here, I'm telling you that this is going wrong here, and nobody's doing anything about it. I'm not saying you don't. Simply when it's going wrong, you stop collecting the data. What you do there is fix it. But if you over measure, if you over collect, the data can become meaningless. So you're looking for reasonable outcomes that you could communicate and report that says, this is how that's going, this is how that's going, this is how that's going. We've had 10 complaints and we've fixed 14 of them or whatever. That kind of thing is what you're looking for, meaningful things that you're going to act on in the measurements. The next one is a functioning team. And the team here is, and again, I'm conscious of size, and the size of the audience will be some small, very small NGBs, there'll be some very large ones. A functioning team is the board, executive staff, volunteers, and no matter the size of the organisation, the team that runs it must be effective and have ways of checking its effectiveness, and a culture that encourages fresh input and listens. So while maintaining the focus on the task, I'm going to talk a little bit about this later on. And the task really is, why are we here? So what's the NGB set up, designed to do? It's the mission, the purpose. It's the why we're here. So a functioning team needs to have that. Certainly board and the CEO, board, senior management team relationship needs to stay focused on that why. But the whole organization should be in it and should be considered part of the functioning team that is involved in that achievement. Revisit and revised is the review, if you like, of the strategy, the operational objectives, the structured. It should be a structured review process, checking that it's working. How we do in reviews that are factual and with enough detail to inform revisions where necessary. So if you look at something, you can see that, yeah, our membership isn't growing the way we expected. So what do you need to do to change to cause that to happen, for example? That's the kind of review that needs to be done. And some of that will be almost continuous, but those reviews are important in that if you need to correct something, there's the opportunity to do it, but you have a process to do the correction that is explicable. So you've thought it through as a team and you've said, yeah, this isn't working, we need to change this, rather than doing that particular revision on the fly, where the revision may not be documented, or the logic for a change isn't documented or properly documented. That's where the governance stuff starts to and can start to unravel. If it's not working, when you look at one of the SMART objectives and suddenly somebody says, well, this isn't realizable, then change it. Because the last thing you want is to say that you're going to grow by 100%, and suddenly the reality is you're growing by 10%. If you retain the objective at the high growth level, then the people are dispirited. They see it as unachievable. Change the objective, and don't be afraid to change the objective. The last bullet here is informed by the current and future context. And the last 5 years has been extraordinary. And I put it down as 5 years in risk management terms, particularly. So business decisions have been driven by unforeseen changes in the external context, particularly. Now, there will be internal issues that may have caused their own trauma within your organizations, but the external stuff, and I just listed a few of them in my head. The Brexit referendum outcome was one of the first, I'm going to say, shocks that impacted or potentially impacted organizations, including NGBs. The pandemic, obviously, the resultant supply chain disruption, the Russian invasion of Ukraine, rampant inflation, climate change. All of these things are causing the review and rethinking and resetting of strategy. I mean, there were sports that literally were shut down for 2 years. Indoor contact sports were shut down for 2 years. No income, no revenue. And membership, unable to participate, began to wander off to other things. These are the impact of the changes in the external context, a lot of them unforeseen. You get a certain amount of people who will be wise after the fact. And there were people who were involved in looking down the barrel of these kind of things. But I don't think anybody fully understood at the time what a lockdown would be in the sporting world. These things demand any big alteration in the external context demands the rethinking of the objectives and risk assessments around the new business, sometimes called paradigms, that new change that is imposed by an external context that you don't have any control over needs to be rethought, and the strategy needs to be reset if that happens and as that happens. And we're now looking at the inflation thing, don't know what that's going to have in terms of the impact on discretionary income, for example. A lot of this stuff is impossible to predict. But sponsorship, sponsorship is hard to get. Salaries are set to rise. Participation and attendances may well drop off as that discretionary spending is reduced in every household. I saw a stat yesterday that it's costing 10 or 11 more euro to fill a car with diesel this week than it was last week. So, that's coming out of the pot that is normally belongs to sport. But there are your future context issues. I'm going to look at the principles of the code, and there are 5 principles you probably know. I'm now looking at the fundamentals of the governance code. So, while the fundamentals of governance we talked about earlier on, this is the codifying governance is something that's been the last 10 years, particularly. I suppose from the banking crisis, there was a sense that there was a looseness in governance. I mean, if you look at the way the banks were regulated 15 years ago, there was one individual and a couple of people working in his office, and that was the regulatory environment. Now you have the central bank and all sorts of other organizations and institutions that are involved in that regulation, both at European level and at global level. So yeah, the whole thing has changed, and that's trickled down into other organisations, and it's following it is something that I know has concerned boards and is causing some head scratching and concern and worry at some levels. Is the senior management regime, where the responsibility and accountability is beginning to flow down too, from board level, and that accountability is beginning to be tested in courts around the world. So you're going to see more of it, but codifying the principle, the governing principle is wasn't a bad thing to do, and the reality is it's here now. So we have to live with it. I said earlier on, it's based originally on the CBC codes. The development of it doesn't matter. It's arrived, and we have it. This particular code is a comply or explain code, and for the most part, the regulator is a fair regulator. So the rules are laid down, and they're an understanding regulator. Talk a little bit about the differences between the A, B, and C type as far as this is concerned in a while. But for the leadership, one of the key issues are the strategy, the people, the objectives of the organisation, and that set in terms of the vision and purpose of the organisation. It's very much the leadership is concerned with why we're here, what is our remit. The control issues, the key issues are compliance, financial control, and risk management. In the transparency and accountability piece, you're looking at communicating and engaging with stakeholders, funders, sponsors, staff, volunteers, and participants, and the accountability in some cases to external, regional, and global organizations. That's where you have a responsibility for the rules of the sport, if you like, for keeping the sport pure in its intent. And in some cases, some of you will also be dealing with professional sports people, professional end, and the Olympic piece as well. Working effectively is about the key elements here: roles and responsibilities, legal duties, delegated responsibilities. Again, it's nuts and bolts kind of stuff, but it needs to be written down, needs to be documented, it needs to be seen to be working. Looking at board performance, looking at succession planning. One of the hottest topics actually in the whole governance space, at the charities level, at not-for-profits, the issue of succession planning is certainly one of the hot topics, and some people struggle with. It hasn't been mandated in the code, but it's close enough, and it's drifting towards that mandate, I would imagine, eventually. Looking in here, the working effectively also looks at external expertise and skills on the board. Performance as a collective and performance as individuals. So talk a little bit about that later. Behaviour deals with the integrity, the honesty, fairness, conflicts of interest, conflicts of loyalty, and the reputation, the resultant reputation of the organisation. The next slide is really just to take it back, I suppose, to NGB and LSPs. The code has compliance requirements built into it. So if you like, there are a set of musts in each of the codes. What I did here was just to break down and explain that we're often asked, what's the difference between A and a B? And if I'm an A, how do I get to be a B? And if I'm a B, how do I get to be a C? And really what this is doing is just sort of giving you a flavor of the differences. You're probably, if you're an A, you're concerned with the A1. There are 90 issues that you need to be compliant with. With the B, there are 118. Now, while they are similar in nature, they're not actually. So some of the requirements in an A, the same requirement will be hardened somewhat when you get to a B level. The same happens a little bit between the B and the C, but it gives you an idea. So 90, 118, and 182 are the requirements. So as far as Sport Ireland are concerned, they asked that all organisations declare they're compliant at a point in time. That's point in time, I think, was last, I can't remember exactly what the date was. I was at a conference in Dublin Castle about 6 or 8 weeks ago, and one of the Sport Ireland people was there, and they said they are over 90% and counting, was how she put it. Over 90 NGBs and counting. So they have a sense that they're sort of well there. And that they're those that have made the declaration that they are compliant with whatever their particular type of code is. She also said that they would be auditing 1 in 10. So that would be an annual audit. So they would expect to audit 1 in 10 as a routine, and will investigate complaints and media reports that suggest there are governance issues at an NGB. So that's normal for regulators, particularly I see it with the Data Protection Commissioner, for example. Usually it's as a result of complaint, they will take action and they do some routine basic auditing. They do have, which is unusual, this regulator, Sport Ireland has the power to withhold funding for non-compliant NGBs, and I think that's well out there. My sense is that it would be very serious. It would be a very serious issue before they would do that. And the other thing is they're a fair regulator, so the probability is you get plenty of heads up before that actually happens. But whatever the issue is, they would be asking that it be clarified and fixed as in a process ahead of them withdrawing or withholding funds. Just again, in a follow on to that, I broke down the where are these requirements. So just give you a sense of where they are. I suppose there's nothing, these are just pure numbers. So the type A has 17 issues to deal with the leadership, or the type C has 33. Well, I suppose the thing that occurred to me looking at this was in the behavior one at the bottom, there's actually very little difference between an A and a B and a C. So really that behavior, that ethical behavior that is expected from every organization, if you like, no matter its size. But that's really just to give you some idea of where those requirements sit in terms of the in terms of the categorization of the code. One other thing is that it does require, and this is in the section 4 of working effectively, is reviewing the performance of the board. And this is, reviewing generally. And this is probably one of the thornier issues, the how-to. So the code speaks about some how-to, and it gives some examples. So if you, on their website, there's some examples of how to do this with questionnaires. The board should conduct a review on a regular basis and evaluate its own performance, assess how it's adapting to challenges of the changing business and regulatory environment. And this is from that code, this is from that website about how the fact of that review that's required. The review should evaluate the individual's and collective performance of board members, its skills, competencies, structures, policies and procedures to ensure that they're fit for purpose. That's a direct quote from the regulator. The second one is about succession and the board succession plan. Succession planning is a way for an organization to ensure its continued effective performance. The main goal of the succession plan is to smooth the transition as board members leave and are replaced. It is important to think not just in terms of board membership, but also committee membership, board and committee chairs, and officer positions. So basically it's suggesting that there's a succession plan for all of these things. The board needs to search constantly for potential members and find new ways to uncover suitable candidates for board positions. So they're expecting a certain amount of turnover without effectively suggesting what that turnover should be. Best practice is probably putting a maximum of maybe anywhere between 6 and 9 years as a maximum for a board member. If you were to look at the code of practice for the governance of state bodies, for example, that's probably, they're talking about 2 terms, 4 years, and even in that, a second term with a question mark after it. So they'd prefer that rotation to happen faster there. With CEOs in the public sector, generally CEO term, the top of an organization, top of the department is 7 years. Sometimes they extend it in finance, but generally that's the kind of way they're thinking. So it's sort of refreshing. Boards, there's nothing stipulated as yet, but we're beginning to see, particularly the UK, and you take your lead, a lot of this stuff comes out of the UK before it gets here. You can expect that that will begin to happen. And in any event, a lot of board members are delighted when there's term limits and that they're in and out of it, and they do their bit and they move on. Reviewing the effectiveness of board is a very hard thing to do. Now, there are templates and questionnaires on the website, and they try to get a handle on how to complete a board review. People are people, so there will be different opinions. Checklists are available from Sport Ireland. They say they're fine, but what do you do with the answers? That's kind of one of the things that, and it's not just the Sport Ireland ones. You'll find people out there with checklists, and you get the board to fill them in and put in their comments, and then it all gets compiled. And about the board performance, it's the way of doing it. But basically, all it's doing is it triggers the discussion. And the truth is, what do you do with the outcomes? And then you have to have a collective meeting at the end of the day to do a review with the outcomes. So not easy. The chair is key, I think. And the first thing that has to be known is, does the chair want to review the board performance? So the chair is key, but the chair needs to be enthusiastic about it and needs to say, yes, we need to review the board performance. Ideally, it's an annual thing. But in my view, there's little substitute for an open, honest conversation. The chair one-on-one with the members, then presenting a summary to the whole board for a wider how do we work as a group conversation around the issues that were raised by the individual members with the chair. The chair and committee chair should meet regularly to discuss committee performance. Some organizations will have representative directors who are obliged to come from a certain perspective, and that happens a lot in sport, where you might have a regional director nominated by whatever the provincial council or whatever it is. They're obliged to come from a certain perspective. And one of the hardest things they have to do is be aware that when they arrive on the board, they are part of the main board, and therefore they're part of the overall vision before the I suppose conflict of loyalty might arise, and that needs to be part of that review. Pointed out in that review. Now, when you start any meeting, there will be talkers, there will be quiet members, there will be personal likes and dislikes, there will be single issue enthusiasts, there will be the infuriating folk who do not prepare for meetings. There will be the people who are always late. There will be no shows, but that's life. But if everybody's focused on the board mission, if everybody's focused on the purpose of the organization and what the board is there to do, those kind of differences kind of get put aside. And I'm going to qualify that by saying most of the time, for the benefit of the organization. And it is most of the time. One of the, I mentioned earlier on that I was at a governance conference in Dublin Castle. I was also at a charities conference in Croke Park recently. And one of the recurring themes in both of them, when there was an open forum discussion about, it was kind of agenda item, the relationship between the board and the CEO. And it's notable that through the pandemic, particularly the pandemic and the other economic external factors I talked about earlier on, would be contributory. But there is a sense that there is a greater friction in some organizations between the board and the CEO. That's stuff that was in the objectives that hasn't been done because the pandemic has caused all sorts of chaos in the organization. The objectives have not been met. Perhaps the objectives haven't been reset. And the result is a more than average or more than normal friction between boards and CEOs, where boards are taking it out on the executive because stuff isn't getting done, where the reality is they're either the CEOs or the executive are talking to the board and say, look, these are the current circumstances and this is a result of whatever it's a result. So that's a point at which the strategy and the objectives we talked about earlier on need to be looked at very, very hard. Because if the organization starts to tear itself apart because certain objectives were simply unachievable, or on the other hand, the organization becomes too forgiving because certain objectives are not now being achieved, then if without the restatement of the objectives, that friction can become damaging to everybody, in effect. So it's important to be aware of it. There's one of the participants at the conference of that talked about up to 20% of CEOs in not-for-profits in the UK believe they're being bullied. It was an incredible statistic, and I found it an incredible statistic. But that's now there's another side to that there are boards who would also tell you that they're being manipulated. So that friction conversation needs to take place as well. So when there's a view going on, the relationship between the board and the CEO or the senior executive team needs to be taken into account, and that needs to be as harmonious as it can be while achieving the objectives of the organization. One of the things that it says is do an individual self-assessment, and again, it's another one of those things we've looked at and found, various ways of doing it. There's all sorts of talk about it. There's no good way of doing it. So what we put together here just was a couple of 2 slides that give you some idea of the kind of things that an individual should be when they're dealing with the board. So a director, well, to be honest, anybody in the executive, anybody who volunteers for the organization could effectively ask themselves, and it's ask themselves, and it's not a quiz, there's no marks, there's no points. It's just these kind of questions that wouldn't do any harm to ask and put in front of individual board members to their own self-assessment, and probably before the conversation they might have with the chair or with whoever to begin to contribute with the overall board appraisal, the annual appraisal of the board. I put up 2 of them, and I actually had only one on the slide deck, and Fiona pointed out to me this morning, well, you put up a man there with a question mark, you've got to put up a lady, so there's a lady and there's a man, so we're gender balanced on the slide deck. But again, I have a total about 40 of these questions, and what they do is they provoke thought, and it's better to provoke the thought, and it gets people into a place where they say, right, this begins to focus. And it's trying to say, focus your behavior on why you're here, and try not to bring in the baggage of other things. Try not to bring in, it's tough. It's tough, but it might help. This slide is something that I suppose it reflects there's kind of a magic that comes together when a task is achieved. This is originally from work I would have done in project management, the project management world. And normally the font size in these is the same. And in leadership terms, I would say that these are 3 elements that are equally important. You need a certain level of attention. I think at a board level, particularly at a national governing body level, the task is the most important. They're all important, but the emphasis is on the task, why we're here. The second one then is the team. So maintaining the team is important as well. and making sure that the team's functioning, making sure that the communication is about that inclusion, because that contributes obviously to the achievement of the task. And then down at the bottom of it, there is these individual needs. So people who volunteer, people who sit on boards, people who come for a purpose, they all have a reason for being there. Sometimes it's satisfaction in seeing the task achieved. Sometimes it's perhaps because they might have a child who's been involved in the sport and got something great out of it. Whatever it is, there are certain individual needs. They should be recognized in as much as they can be, but those needs are subservient to the maintenance of the team and the achievement of the task. And the task should be the main event. A couple of things around the requirements of the governance code, reporting. And reporting is an issue that specifically the governance code for sport did not specify any particular reporting requirement. However, some of the NGBs are also charities, and the LSPs are also charities, and some of them will have to comply with both codes. So you'll be familiar with the charities compliance report form. It's a very prescriptive document that has very specific requirements that need to be available. They don't actually want the report. You don't need to submit it, but you need to confirm to them that you have it available for submission for the charities. But this is a typical report for sport, and it allows or makes provision for evidencing. I'm going to show you this because this is actually from, it's a Welsh Sport Wales document that sets out. So if you, I'm not sure you can see my cursor, but if you look at the keys, the cells at the top, so they're looking at small NGBs, so if you like A class in the on the top bar, they're the pink ones, which would receive from them up to 20,000 sterling. And the next one is up to 100, and from 100 to 375, and then from 375 and above. So basically you're looking at like, it's their version of the ABC. And on the top with the ticked box, these are the things that must be in place for all of them. So all of them have to have a strategic plan, and it has to be regularly monitored. And this is, by the way, this is one of 9 capabilities in Wales. And then down the bottom, if you look here, there's suggested evidence as appropriate to organisations. What they're looking for is similar to the Charities Governance Code, not yet the Sports Governance Code, but my sense is coming soon to the Sports Governance Code will be things like the AGM minutes showing the reports, or when you get all the way over here, you're looking at some in terms of the detail that they require. That grows with the larger organization. So my sense is that there will be evidencing requirements coming shortly. I'm going to say in the next year or perhaps year or two, there will be a need for the evidencing requirements to be included in the reporting for the sports regulator, Sport Ireland. That's kind of it. For those of you who don't know us, that's a little picture of some of the things that we do. And I suppose if there are any questions, I thank you for your time, your patience, and apologies if I've overrun a bit. But if there's any questions, Fiona, I'll hand it back to you.
There was one question quite earlier on, but I think you covered it off, Paul. It was, can you let us know who the executive refers to, please, whether it's the board, the CEO, etc., or all? That was from Valerie.
Yeah, it is. Yeah, that I referenced the size a number of times. I know that there are NGBs out there that are all voluntary, and they're collective, and the responsibility is it's a combination. It is that team, whatever that team is.
Yep. And another question there from Joe. You mentioned the need for board to be reviewed regularly, in inverted commas. What is meant by regularly? Is that every year or every 2 years?
I would say board review every year. And I would also, and I mean, strategies to say, you could write down, and probably if you went looking at the code, you could probably say, well, you could do your strategy every 3 years. And I think design and write the strategy every 3 to 5, every 3 years, say, but review every year. And the same is true with the board, because there's changes, there's always changes. It's best practice. It's not necessarily codified. You're not trying to satisfy. It's just good practice. If you do the board review, nobody's surprised by change, or people are less surprised by change if you do it. So I would say do it every do it at least, do it every year. You know, you can go mad and start doing it every quarter or whatever. You don't need to do that. My sense is that review it every year is sensible. And I would say review the strategic plan every year too. You're not going to rewrite, but review, because, and I think one of the most important things is to bear in mind is that that external context is forcing the review and revision of an awful lot of stuff on a continuous basis. So you might say, guys, we have to review the strategic plan every 6 months. We have to review the objectives every 6 months, because this external context is changing that fast. And I think the executive, where there is a CEO, where there's managing the objectives, the operational objectives, they're seeing that, they're looking at that, and the pace of that change is significant. So yeah, keeping the board informed of that, so the board aren't surprised by it, I think is important as well. And I know that that means that might be the same 12 people or same 10 people in the room or on the meeting, you know, where the small organization will have all that information in the group, because the executive, effectively the executive is the board, where they're volunteers. So yeah, sorry, I hope that answered the question. I would do annual board reviews.
And that's it for questions, Paul.
Okay, I hope you found it useful, and I suppose we don't sell at these things, but you know where to find us. So thank you very much, and I hope you got something out of it. Now, we will send out as normal the access to the recording and the slide deck. So that'll be coming out to you probably by Friday, I would imagine. Fiona, am I correct?
Oh yeah, I would say it come out sooner than that, but definitely by Friday.
Okay. All right. Thank you for your time and attention, and go back and enjoy your sport.